Welcome here, welcome at this DLD meetup, welcome at the Burda Bootcamp. We're really happy to have you here. So, you might be asking yourself, what is actually DLD, or what is Burda Bootcamp, or what do they have in common? Well, the DLD is a tech conference which has been around for more than 10 years. They have conferences in New York, Tel Aviv, Munich, of course, as well, Brussels. And they have been talking about tech trends and what's coming up in the next years. And we at Burda Bootcamp are doing different things. We're not a conference. What we're doing here is helping startups to get to the next level. We also help young techies or young entrepreneurs to develop their idea in a sort of a mini incubation program. And we run tech events like hackathons or these awesome meetups. So the question is, what do we have in common? Well, we both belong to Burda Media, which is, well, it started over 100 years ago, and it used to be a typography, basically. It now developed to a media and tech company. We have assets like, Playboy in Germany, or, I know nobody reads Playboy here. Or we also have Focus Online or Focus Magazine, but some other digital stuff as well, like Sing, which is the German LinkedIn, or Clicks, which is the private search engine, or Holdercheck, which helps you find your next travel. We have a revenue of 2.2 billion, and 50% is digital. So we're always looking for new cool people like developers, designers, product managers. This is just a short spot. If you're looking for a job, have a look at the wall over there. And that's basically it with self-promotion. So tonight we're hosting a meetup with two really great, brilliant engineers. And we have two very special guests. The one of them is Aditya Agarwal. Aditya is the CTO of Dropbox. And before joining Dropbox, he was the director of product engineering at Facebook. He was responsible for such products as, for example, Newsfeed, Search, Photos, or Profile. And he was also one of the first engineers at Facebook. So if you have any questions, how it was like, you can ask them afterwards. Please give a warm round of applause for Aditya. We also have a very special engineer, a German engineer, Florian Leibert. He's the founder of Mesosphere, and this is a startup whose products run on the open source project Apache Mesos. How many engineers are there in the room? Please raise your hands. How many startup guys? How many startup people? Okay, great. So Florian, before founding Mesosphere, Florian was at Twitter and Facebook, where he helped develop the critical data infrastructure. So please give a warm round of applause to Florian. We also have a very special guest. He wasn't announced, but his name is Dennis Woodside. And Dennis is the Chief Operating Officer at Dropbox. Please welcome Dennis here as well. Great. Schedule. What are we going to do here? We will start with a short keynote by Aditya. Please think of your questions afterwards, after the fireside chat with Florian, because then two, or basically three of you, are going to join us on stage where you can ask any sort of questions you've always wanted to ask. So Aditya, please come on stage. The floor is yours. These were two of the guys.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I have a bunch of slides, but I thought that I would actually shortcut that because the room is fairly small, and I would much rather actually spend the. Do I actually need the mic, or can everyone hear me? Oh, we need the mic for the podcast. Okay, cool. I would actually much rather focus the majority of the time on answering questions that people have, which is what I find the most value from these kinds of settings. So before I get into my talk track, I basically thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself and my history. So I've been working in Silicon Valley now for about 13 years. When I first graduated from college, which was 13 years ago, most of the smart kids in my class were going to go work on Wall Street to go develop fancy trading algorithms, be quants and so on. And I said, fuck that, because I thought it was really important that you as an engineer should be building the product that your company was selling, right? And not actually just be implementing something that somebody else came up with. So I took up a decidedly unsexy job of working at Oracle. So I was actually working on the Oracle database kernel, actually working on essentially improving how databases work for 1 year. And it was a fun job, it was a fun gig for 1 year. But I still remember this crazy moment when I walked into my manager's office when I was 22 years old, and I asked her, when is the first time that the code that I write will ever be actually used in production? And she said 4 years from today. And I told her I am quitting that day, because I could not actually handle the idea that it would take so long that something I'd worked on would actually get out into production. So then I started looking around for a job, and I lucked out. This is all luck, right? You create your own luck, which was pretty lucky. I just happened to run into Mark Zuckerberg in the summer of 2005 when Zuck decided that this Facebook thing was a real deal and he was actually going to grow the company. And this is an interesting story, I think, for every entrepreneur out there, which is that I walked into the office, aka the house that Facebook had, and essentially I had never used the product. Because Facebook was launched at my university after I graduated, so I never used the product. But I remember walking in, there were video games everywhere, there were beer bottles everywhere, and I remember thinking, oh my god, this is exactly like being back at college. I'm having so much fun just interviewing here, that why wouldn't I want to work here every day, especially if they're giving me the same essentially salary as Oracle is. And I think the lesson there is that so many times as entrepreneurs, we keep on focusing on what we are building, and we forget that the reason why people come to work every day is how we are actually building it. What is the environment, what is the culture, what are you actually, how are you creating this family at work that actually convinces people to come into work every day, right? That was my first lesson. So I joined Facebook when it was about 10 people, about 5 engineers, and I had a pretty good time there. I wrote the Facebook search engine. I worked on Facebook newsfeed. I was one of the original authors of the Facebook ad system, which I hear is making multiple billions of dollars a year nowadays. And it was just a fascinating ride because you just learn so much when the company is growing that quickly. And I got the chance to see the company grow from 10 people to when I left, 5 years or 6 years later, there's about 2,500 people, which was a fun ride. And then I left Facebook because I thought that, okay, it's time to go try something new. How do I challenge myself? How do I push myself again? So I left and I started my own company, which is called Cove, which most of you have never heard of. It's because, you know why? It's because starting a company is really hard. And most companies actually end up failing. And my company didn't do particularly well. In about 18 months, we went from zero to zero in revenue. And we went from 3 co-founders to about 6 or 7 of us all together. Then we got acquired by Dropbox, which was and Drew and Raj were incredibly enthusiastic about folding our company and our product into their vision. And lo and behold, 5 years later, I've been at Dropbox for about 5 years, and we have grown the company from 20 engineers, 70 people altogether to, wow, we have 700 engineers today working at Dropbox. And about 17 or 1800 people at the company. We have grown from 40 million users to upwards of 500 million users today. And we have grown from very little in revenue to a lot. I can't give you the actual numbers. But it's been a good ride because I think that what's been fascinating is actually being able to compare and contrast the experience of working at Facebook, obviously a hugely successful company, seeing my own startup, and also seeing Dropbox, and seeing how all the commonalities behind them, and sometimes not the commonalities, essentially scaling those companies. So, with that in mind, I think that this is the only slide I want to put up here. I have a bunch of different slides, but I'm not going to get into them in detail. But the thing that I've learned that's really interesting is that all of these companies, especially when an entrepreneur, you'll go to a bunch of these conferences and you'll have people like me standing up in front of you, telling you all of these best practices for essentially scaling your companies. But the best advice I've ever gotten is that the only constant in any rapidly growing company is change. Which is if anybody ever tells you that they have shit figured out in terms of how to do recruiting, how to do product management, how to do project management, how to do scaling, it's just not true, because at any given company, even at Facebook and at Dropbox, all I've seen is essentially things changing up every 6 months. Every 6 months we end up completely redoing how we are essentially a process for building, a process for recruiting, a process for essentially engineering management. So the only constant I've ever seen in all these companies is essentially this desire for change and this complete comfort with the idea that how you're doing things today will invariably essentially end up changing every 6 or 9 months. And if you cannot get comfortable with that change, then you're probably not cut out for actually working at a hypergrowth startup. And with that in mind, I shall move over to Florian. I think we have the next section, right? Yeah.
That was it.
Yes. That's all I have.
Okay, let's get started. So Florian, you are basically known as one of the most famous Germans in the Silicon Valley. Is that true? And can you tell more about that? How did you achieve that?
I don't know if that's true, but if you say so. Well, a little bit about my background. So I came to Silicon Valley also 8 years ago, not quite as long as Aditya, but 8 years ago I moved to Silicon Valley, and I first started actually working at Twitter. So most of you probably know Twitter, right? It's now with the next president an even more popular medium. So I started working at Twitter, and actually when I worked at Twitter, we had a massive scalability problem. So how many of you know the fail whale?
Oh, yeah.
Most of you guys do, right? So the fail whale was actually an indication that Twitter was over capacity. And well, that happened because Twitter actually at the time had a bunch more features than Facebook had. One of them was, it was real time. So you wrote a tweet and it was sent immediately. And then there was an unbound follower, and we had it as a problem, but it was a feature. So we also call it the Justin Bieber problem. So Justin Bieber has 10 million followers. So if he sends a message, he probably now has actually 50 million, I don't know the exact number, but if he sends a message, you have to do 50 million real-time inbox deliveries. That's a real big problem actually. Imagine you send an email and 50 million messages need to be delivered right then. So on the infrastructure of a startup, that's a big burden. And our team was really tasked to solve this problem because it resulted in a lot of downtime, right? So Twitter was growing back then at hyperscale, so we had exponential user growth, and with each user added, the number of messages actually, or every time we doubled in users, we actually quadrupled or our traffic grew actually tenfold. So that problem meant that we had to redesign the entire architecture of our website. And we did so by really taking apart this early version of Twitter, which was built as a single monolithic code block, and writing what now is called microservices, right? So you're basically separating this large problem into smaller problems that teams in parallel can solve. And well, we decided that we wanted to use a cloud-like platform, and we wanted to give our developers the ability to just deploy their code very quickly, because more and more of these services were popping up. And yeah, so we decided actually to use a software that one of my close friends wrote. It was called Apache Mesos. It was open source, and that's a big trend in Silicon Valley, that you use open source technologies and you no longer use proprietary software. And we decided to build our next platform on Apache Mesos. And in a nutshell, if you know what AWS is, right, Amazon Web Services, one of the fastest growing enterprise businesses out there, what our software does, it gives you the same set of capabilities, but on any cloud or on your own hardware. So you don't have to actually be locked into Amazon in order to make your developers as productive as they would be on Amazon. And while we used Mesos, we rewrote the site, and within a couple of years, actually, we reached stability, and Twitter no longer had the fail whale problem. And so after a couple of years at Twitter, I actually joined Airbnb, and at Airbnb, we had a similar problem. We designed a page initially that was a monolithic code block. We had to take it apart. We had to we had to give our developers new tools in order to be more productive. And so we again used the software that we had used at Twitter, called Apache Mesos, and solved Airbnb's problem. And then actually, my friends and I, so two friends of mine, one of them was writing Apache Mesos as part of his PhD thesis over at UC Berkeley. We decided to create a company around it because it seemed like not just Twitter or Airbnb would have these problems. And yeah.
Who are your customers now?
So we have a number of customers. I can't talk about all of them, but some large ones are Verizon Wireless. They are one of the largest cell phone carriers in the world. We have a very large German insurance company, a German discount supermarket, which most people know. And well, in the US we have probably close to somewhere between 50 and 100 customers, but those are all very, very large companies.
What's your valuation right now?
I didn't bring my communications person. I can't talk about
Can I play your communications person for a moment?
You want to answer this question? I actually don't know.
Okay, right. So what I think is like the revolutionary thing about your company, because what I read last time was that you have a valuation of 500 million, but I guess it's a little bit more now. So what's so revolutionary about that?
So about our software. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about valuations. Valuations are a snapshot in time, and they don't.
Nobody cares for valuation.
Well, I mean, it's kind of a meaningless number in my opinion, right? It's like what is a publicly traded company worth at any given point in time, right? It goes up and down. So what's revolutionary about our software? So there's a really interesting quote from Mark Andreessen, which he said, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago in the Wall, I think it was the New York Times. And the quote was, "Software is eating the world," right? And what does that mean? Well, every company today is becoming a software company. So one of our customers actually is a large, it's similar to Siemens, but you guys can probably figure out what the company is. They manufacture turbines, and what they actually do, turbines today have a lot of sensors, right? And why do turbines have sensors? Well, because they record how efficient the turbine is, maybe it needs to be maintained, and so forth, right? You can actually save a lot of fuel, but you can also save lives, because you don't want to figure out that the turbine failed once the plane crashed, right? You want to hopefully do this ahead of time. And what's happening with companies like that, they need to really rethink the way they engineer their products. Same goes for autonomous driving. A car, one autonomous car actually produces up 0.5 petabyte of data per day. Right? So it has LiDAR, it has HD cameras, it has GPS. All of this data needs to be sent somewhere. And all traditional car companies are now needing to really become software companies, because I think autonomous driving is going to be a reality sooner than we probably think. And yeah, so that's what our software enables these companies to do. It enables you to process data faster, to process more data, to store the data, and really make your developers much more productive.
It's actually a very good point, because as you were talking about Andreessen, I've got a quite recent quote from him, which says, "Software programs the world." Mark Andreessen is talking about that in the sense that new platforms and new distributed platforms appear, and like cloud or software as a service, or new interfaces like chatbots or voice interfaces, but as well as deep learning, machine learning stuff, artificial intelligence, and big and small data. So my question would be, what does that actually mean for existing industries and for your business in particular?
So I think a lot of mid-sized companies and a lot of large companies really have to change the way that they actually develop products, right? And you see this in car manufacturing, for example. So traditionally, a car has a really long development cycle, right? So years. So I rented a BMW the other day, and in my middle console was this weird thing that I have to use in order to really like put my location into the map, or my target location into the map. And I gave up after about 2 minutes and I just used my iPhone because it's ridiculous. This technology is 15 years old, but that's because the development cycle of cars it's treated like a hardware product. Now think Tesla in comparison, right? So Tesla, there was a tweet about maybe 2 months ago where a Tesla driver actually complained that some people use the Tesla charging stations as a parking lot, right? They just leave their cars there. And so he tweeted this, and then the CEO, Elon Musk of Tesla, actually responded, hey, we'll fix this. And literally within 2 weeks, they had it fixed, and you had to now, you had to pay actually if you left your car longer at the charging stations. So Tesla as a company in general is able to push out product features much more quickly than traditional companies. And this is not just about like writing software. It's really about how a company thinks, right? It's how a company operates, and how everybody that company hires needs to really shift their thinking into, wow, we're now doing software. We're no longer doing hardware. We're really doing software. And it's same goes for the autonomous driving feature that Tesla introduced, right? One of my friends has a Tesla, and he dropped it. Well, he hit the car. We drove to dinner, and I actually wasn't part of it. I just heard the story. I wasn't in the car. But so he drove to dinner. He parked his car, and when he came back from dinner, the car could drive itself. I mean, that's
well, that's a good software update.
Yeah, right. That's 100% complete. So the progress bar. But yeah, so I think a lot of companies really have to rethink how they build products, and I think that's I think Mark is right that really every company has to become a software company.
So do you really believe that companies like BMW are ready to disrupt themselves?
I don't know if they're ready to disrupt themselves, but I think they have to, right? But by the way, I think it actually represents a lot of opportunity to tradition. If you look back like 100 years, nobody had a car, right? You look back 50 years, few people had cars, and really cars were a thing once finance got involved and once people could finance cars. So all of a sudden you had this model where you lease a car, and that actually created a huge market. And I think the next step actually is think about paying per mile. Like think about transport no longer as like this fixed cost thing, as this asset that you acquired at some point, but think about it as how much am I willing to pay per mile, and then what features to add. And I think that's in general, like this feature-driven thinking is enabling totally new businesses, right? In San Francisco, for example, it actually doesn't make much sense to have a car, and not because the public transit system is great, but because you have Uber, and you have Uber Pool, and it costs you $5 to go from one part of the city to another, and you can do work while you're doing that.
Yeah, once I rode with Uber and or with the German counterpart of Uber, my taxi, and the driver told me, we hate Uber, and Uber is never gonna disrupt our industry because you always will need people for that. He was really believing what he was saying. And I guess this guy's gonna be like jobless in 10 years. So what would you do with those people who land without having a job and without having any qualification for the future?
It's a tough question. I think the reality is that I think technology always actually enables people to do more work and more effective work, right? And I think if you think back 200 years ago, the textile industry, right? Or 100 years ago, I guess it changed. The textile industry was largely automated, and I think, people who worked in that industry moved into other industries, did other jobs. I think the most important thing, though, to think about is how do we really educate people in order for them to do more meaningful work, and in order for them to do work that's going to get automated. I think a lot of jobs will get automated. Think about driving a truck, right? I think that's one of the largest number of jobs out there, and I think that's going to go away in the next 20 years or so. I don't know the exact time, but I think that can be automated, and there are companies that are really progressing there. And what does that mean? Well, it means you actually can get more utilization out of a truck, because right now trucks have to, they're dormant half the time because you can only drive 12 hours. Some countries 8 hours, some countries maybe 14 hours, but you can, you see trucks oftentimes at a gas station stopped and parked, and I think that's going to be a thing of the past, I think. And what does that mean? Well, it means actually that it's probably going to be cheaper for you to get your boots, right? Because the cost will go down, and I think that enables you to buy more things. And so the economic effects, I think, that we don't really grasp today, but that happen, and that will create other jobs.
What do you think? Will everything shift to the cloud in the long term?
So I think in IT, we always see these cycles. So there's a huge trend, and then there's another trend, and then there's another trend. And I think with the cloud, it's just like that. So right now there are a lot of use cases where cloud computing makes a lot of sense. But I think specifically as the Internet of Things matures, right? And Internet of Things really is that your home has a thermostat that's connected to the web. Your car is basically connected to the web. As that happens, and as you have petabytes and petabytes of data moving, a centralized location actually doesn't make sense. So we see this already, and I think what's going to happen is we're going to have a whole other industry in IT that's forming around cloud, around edge computing. So meaning you're going to place small data centers close to a mobile tower. You're going to place small data centers all around Germany in order to harvest basically this data that's being emitted from the cars. And so I think there's certainly a lot of use cases where a centralized cloud makes sense, but I don't think that's in IT. Nothing is ever the ends all be all, right? Like we don't really have that. So I think it's going to be a huge industry. I think it's going to disrupt a lot of these old nascent businesses out there. But I think there's another really big market at the edge.
Right.
And that's, by the way, what our software is built for. How many of you actually know serverless programming? Okay.
Okay, which basically brings us to the next questions. If everything is going to be connected, and it's going to be connected, what about the favorite German word called Datenschutz, data security? What's your view on that? Is there going to be such a thing as Datenschutz, or can we forget it basically?
Well, I think it's a great question, and actually we talk about this a lot at work. So if you look at some of the current businesses, like think about Google, right? What's Google's advantage? They have a lot of data, and that's why actually Microsoft with Bing was not able to catch up, because I think when you have data, and data is your competitive advantage, well, the data is actually more meaningful than cash. Now I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say that I think the current way we have balance sheets is actually outdated. I think in 10 years we'll have to put data on our balance sheet, and it's not just an asset; it's also a liability. I'm still actually puzzled why in the U.S., which is a country that loves litigation, right? Like we have a lot of lawyers, we have a lot of judges, we have like a whole legal system that's a huge industry. I'm still really puzzled why companies that are getting hacked, why they're not getting sued for billions of dollars, right? I mean, and I think that's probably going to happen at some point. And I think at some point you'll have to really figure out what data do you need and what data do you not need, and probably what you don't need you shouldn't record. That's the consumer speaking, right? Like me as the consumer speaking, because I actually don't want all my social security numbers across the interwebs. And yeah, so I think data privacy is actually an issue that companies don't really take very serious right now. At least not serious enough. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all these leaks and hacks. But I think at some point it will be even more important. And yeah, I think companies should disclose what sort of data they're actually recording.
Well, it's going to be fun. Thank you, Florian.
Thank you.
Dennis, Aditya. Aditya, would you join us on the stage, please? And now, guys, you have a possibility to ask questions. How many of you have questions to ask? Dennis, you are an Iron Man, which you just wrote in your Twitter account.
Yes. Which I what?
Which is the just read on your Twitter account.
Oh, yes.
What do you think? What are the main principles of sports, quite hard sports, which you can transfer to business?
Also, Dennis, why are you an Iron Man?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, like why do you do this to yourself?
Why do you have time for that?
So, yeah, so I've done 11 Ironman now. And I think like lots of hobbies or passions, it creeps up on you. So I was a competitive rower in college. And then the problem with rowing as a sport is once you finish your collegiate education, it's hard to row when you're holding down a full-time job. You have to get a team and all the rest. So a buddy of mine challenged me to do a triathlon, and I actually did pretty well, and I stuck with it. But I think, I think it's important to have something outside of work. And the good thing about triathlon, some people do yoga, some people meditate, but just having that ability to go out and train. I went for a run yesterday in the English Garden in the snow, and you get time to think. And I think that's important for anybody who's working, is having time to think. I think the other thing is it does teach you a little bit about failure, because I've competed in probably 100 triathlons and I've never won a single one. The best I've done is second. And so you have to deal with the fact that there's always something a bit faster, and there's always more you can do to get better. And you have to think about, well, how am I going to improve? What did I learn from that race that I can apply in the next race? What are the mistakes that I made that I can correct? Where did I do well? How do I adjust my training? So it's very much a thinking sport, which I think is true in any professional career. You have to always, you're not going to win. You don't go into a meeting and come out of a meeting and say, I won the meeting, right? You kind of learn things that you did well, things that you didn't do well, and you go on from there. So I think those are some of the things that I've learned from that.
Thank you. Before we get to the audience questions, we've talked about the quote that software is eating the world, but basically there are people behind the software who program it, right? So my question to all of you would be, how do you actually hire and retain top coding talent? And what are your recommendations for other companies?
I think that the first thing in terms of hiring and retaining the best engineering talent is obviously to be able to point them towards big problems. Because much like Dennis said, right, some of the world's best athletes are essentially attracted to the biggest problems. And how many of you actually know what an Ironman is? Yeah, an Ironman is like an insane thing to like embark on. It's like you are cycling, running, and swimming more than anybody ever does, like by itself, right? But I think the reason why Dennis is attracted to it is because it's the biggest challenge that he could find. And much like similarly for engineers, I think that the question that I ask myself is, what is the biggest problem that I can point them towards? And if I can find and craft and like really articulate that particular problem, then I'm like confident that like the world's best engineers will both want to like work on that and like kind of be retained over time. But the second part of that is also that the best engineers want to work with the other best engineers. So if you can create a sense of a team, and that it's not just about like a solo person working on the most hard problem, but actually like we are tackling it as a team, and we're doing so in a collaborative manner that's like fun for us to like hang out with each other and do so. I think that's the surefire formula. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Florian.
You said them all. No, I think so too. I think the most important thing is that you're working on a really hard problem. And yeah. I think I think you can't hire an infrastructure engineer who's been building Google's file system in order to build a mobile app probably that's going to show you some food recommendations. It's not going to. I think that's not going to be challenging for that person. I think we're all looking for challenges in our lives, right? And so I'm saying the same thing as you guys in different words, but I think that's the most important thing. I think obviously I think Silicon Valley has created an atmosphere where work is really fun, right? Like so, Google is kind of the canonical example for that. You have the Google campus, which really looks like a playground, right, it's a playground for adults where you can eat a lot of food and it's all free, and you don't actually have to do work. You can just hang out. But no, I'm kidding. But that's kind of the perception that it has, right? But really, like I think all of these great engineers that are working there, they work there because what they're building is difficult. It hasn't been done before, and they want to have an impact.
Okay, so it's all about the challenges and like the level of difficulty. What you have to create is sort of an Iron Man for software development. Right. Any questions from the audience? Yes?
Thank you very much for being here. My question would be about data privacy and stuff. You're talking that probably we'll have some sort of balance sheet for data. Would it be something like data emission regulations for IoT devices and cars, whatever, so we can't emit more than 5 gigabytes of data per day or whatever? Because I can imagine something like that, and it's quite worrying. Thank you.
I don't know if I have the answer to this, but I mean, I don't think regulation in general solves the issue, right? Like I think when you have just government make up some rules, especially from people who are not practitioners, I think that the result is usually, well, I don't think it's usually the best result, right? But I think some regulation and I think some course of the legal system, right, will hopefully remedy it. I think over time companies will figure out like what they need to collect. I don't know, how is it for you guys over at Dropbox? Actually, you guys handle data of hundreds of millions of people every day and a lot of private data. How do you guys think about it?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, the market has a role to play, and for us, at the end of the day, trust is what people are looking to Dropbox for. So if we're not worthy of our consumer or business's trust, very quickly those consumers or businesses will find another place to go. There are plenty of very large competitors that they could use. So I think what you are seeing is it's still very early, but you're starting to see the market correct some of the challenges. You were mentioning that there have been a number of breaches. You know, consumers notice those breaches, and companies that are breached are less likely to earn the trust of consumers and businesses going forward. I think for us, you know, it's much harder when you're a smaller company. It's actually a lot easier now. We've hired some of the world's best security engineers who are coming from places like Google and Facebook, state of the art, really understand what's going on, can apply what they've learned to our data infrastructure, ensure Dropbox is secure. And but I think when you're a startup, it's hard because there's so much to learn, and if you've got 30 people, do you hire the 31st person to be a security engineer, or do you need somebody else who's going to actually build the consumer or user-facing product? So I think it's more of a challenge earlier in the company's life than it is later, but that could potentially open up business opportunities for someone else to come in and solve that problem for smaller companies as well. So that's a little bit about how we think of it.
Yeah. I think the other thing that I find fascinating about the security discussion is that we often tend to think of it in terms of a single user question. It's always about my data, right? My data over a particular service. But I think what we often think about at Dropbox is that the most interesting applications are always about collaboration and essentially when people are collaborating with each other. And especially in companies, in teams, in organizations that span boundaries and borders today, what does it mean to actually have data localization? And essentially when there's a company that's centered around 3 different countries around the world, right? Whose actually laws are you actually going to follow if your company is actually localized in those 3 different places? And I think that as a company, what we are trying to do is obviously doing right by our users, whatever our users want, we're going to do right by them, but also hopefully to shape the debate, to essentially ask the question that you just asked, but hopefully to ask it on a more global level, which is that in a world where essentially you have these competing forces, what is the right answer? And I don't think anybody knows yet, but hopefully we're asking the right question as a company. Yeah.
To Flo in specific, but also to Dennis and Aditya. And all three of you talked about your motivation, and that was directly connected to innovation, to solve something that hasn't been done before. So, talking about Germany and innovation in particular the tech startup sphere. There is some, of course. I mean, I think seen from abroad, Germany is also widely popular for big company that tries to imitate companies and does some food delivery services and stuff. But there is real innovation here. Still, Germany, I think, is a bit behind, especially if you compare it to areas like the Nordics, which everybody talks about right now, which are great. And it's really, it's stunning statistics that 10%, or if it's true, of the world's unicorns come from the Nordics. So, and I kind of looked into this and thought, okay, why is that? And then some explanation was, which sounds very reasonable, is that for some reason, people from the Nordics, since they have micro markets, were always forced to think very globally. And so, at a very early stage, entrepreneur-like people from the Nordics went to the Silicon Valley, which for sure is the cradle of innovation, and then somehow learned innovation, and which is connected to courage. And after 10 years, probably after they earned their merits, brought it back to the Nordics, and then brought this whole culture there. Okay, so now the actual question would be to all of you and Florian. Do you see this in the Silicon Valley? Are there any people from Germany probably who are somehow, I mean, have been there now 10, 15 years and probably would come back to Germany and kind of bring the culture here or stuff like this?
Well, I think actually, I think it's kind of hard to answer this question, but I think in order to really understand how Silicon Valley was built, you guys should all go and watch a TED Talk. It's actually not a TED Talk, it's a video. And it's called The Secret History of Silicon Valley by Steve Blank. Have you guys watched that actually? It's phenomenal. And it actually talks about the origins and how Silicon Valley developed. So I really recommend it. It's about an hour talk. Write it down. It's probably one of the best pieces of history around Silicon Valley that's out there. And it really shows like that Silicon Valley was born out of the military spend. I mean, right? So 80 years ago, 70 years ago, when a world war was going on, there was a radio lab called the Stanford Radio Lab, and was his name Terman? I don't know. I forgot his name. But there was essentially a government program that was supposed to help with the war, and government spending went into getting technology that would allow the US to win the war, and the Second World War. And that technology spent actually spawned a bunch of startups, and these startups thrived because of the war, actually. And then after the war, they continued to thrive. There was a lot of continuous government spending going into it, and that's really like what bootstrapped Silicon Valley. And you have all of the very first Silicon Valley companies were tied to the defense industry. And well, it's not really about the defense industry here, but the argument is that government can do a lot of funding initiatives, and when you have a really rich ecosystem, like you have in the US, where large companies buy smaller companies for innovation, you have really a cycle going where money that's being invested actually results in returns for the investors, so they will put more money to use, and yeah, so it was bootstrapped by government and then an ecosystem formed, and I think that's the key to it, and I think given how much money is involved in defense, it makes sense that an ecosystem like that can get bootstrapped. So I think when countries put $1 billion into the startup ecosystem, it's really not very much, right? Like that's meaningless. You really need to have massive amounts of money involved in order to create an ecosystem. So watch that talk. It's phenomenal.
So I lived in Europe for 4 years. I worked for Google for 11 years before Dropbox, and 4 of those in Europe. So to say something a little controversial, I think that the level of ambition that founders like Zuckerberg demonstrate is so much higher than what I saw among a lot of European companies. So it's radically different. And I mean, you can talk to Facebook, but I think these guys started out thinking globally from day one. And it was very different.
And you know, one thing I'd add is that I've recently been much more involved with the Indian ecosystem. In particular, I'm closely involved with a company called Flipkart, which is like India's version of Amazon or Alibaba. And one of the things that's really fascinating to me, I think that's in the Indian ecosystem for the last like 3 or 4 years, has been like the level of ambition that people have had, which is that in the past, as soon as people got close to like, you know, that $100 million exit, they were just like super, like, you know, that's it, right? That was like success defined for an Indian company. But recently, everyone is just like, no, I want to create the next global $100 billion company that is going to be centered in India. And if you don't have the level of ambition, you know, if you don't start from there, you're just never going to get there. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that too. So I just wanted to tell a really quick story about this. So when we first pitched Mesosphere to Andreessen Horowitz, it was about 3.5 years ago. It was really interesting because Mark sat across from me, and Mark actually asked me this question. He's like, so if we gave you $1 billion, how quickly could you build what Amazon has today? So Amazon Web Services. And so we said, well, we already built half of it. but what this underlines is really like how people in Silicon Valley think, right? They really take this. I mean, Amazon Web Services is one of the fastest growing enterprise businesses of all times, right? Like in less than 10 years, they've gotten to $10+ billion of revenue, and they're still growing. I mean, they're still growing like 50 or 60% annually. It's phenomenal. And yeah, I mean, Mark obviously saw this years ago. He saw that this move is happening to the cloud, that this is a massive business, and he tried to figure out what can we invest in that actually has a similar trajectory, or could have a similar trajectory. And I think that's the mindset. I think shooting for the moon, and if it fails, hopefully you at least leave a big crater. Yeah.
That's it.
Any other questions?
So you all have kind of touched on how our global economy is getting smaller and how regulation in different companies or in different countries, excuse me, that deviation is kind of interest to you guys as a global company. And Florian, you briefly voiced your skepticism towards regulation, but also said something really interesting, and we're talking about how everything's going to be a software company, or everything's going to be a software problem, and also described how, in the example of Musk, he can act on customer grievances very fast. Bezos can do something similar, but it's a very Zuckerberg as well, very top-down model though. So you have kind of a consolidation of power at the top that can act really fast. And so my question to you is, how do you see that happening in government as well? Software and tech kind of influencing how we do regulation, how we do, how we can kind of form our world in a fast and more efficient way. Because everything right now is private sector, and do you see that kind of seeping into public sector? What are the trends you see there?
I mean, you're clearly asking about Trump. You know, it's interesting. I think you have actually a really good observation that for all of the companies that you mentioned, whether it be Facebook and Zuck, whether it be any of Elon's 3 companies, essentially the ability that he has to be able to act top down, given the information that he has, and kind of the structural setup of those companies. I actually find that more than being top down, a lot of these companies are actually so much more organic and bottoms up, right? Because I personally know obviously folks at Facebook, but also folks who work at places like Tesla and SpaceX, and I view those companies as being thriving examples of essentially innovation that's happening at scale, which is that despite having a super strong leader that is giving them top-down guidance, there's just a ton of bottoms-up innovation happening. So despite my tongue-in-cheek comment about Trump earlier, I'm still pretty hopeful that our political establishment, at least in the United States, will continue to remain have a healthy dose of like Trumpism, right? Top down, essentially tweeting, and essentially like bottoms up innovation, which I think is kind of the way historically it's always been. Yeah. Here's your take.
So I was thinking about something a little bit different. I have spent time with governments in different parts of the world as well as in the US, and it's always really interesting. A lot of times it comes down to the personalities who are actually driving the policies or the government. So you have something similar in Europe as in the US. In the US, I was heading up a division for Google that built phones, and we were thinking about where to put a big factory. And we called up the governor's office for California, and we literally couldn't get a call back. And then we called up Texas, and we had a meeting with the governor like the next week. So where did the factory go? It went to Texas, right? The policies, the innovation, like the mindset was the governor of Texas and the government had decided that technology was important for the future of the state, and it was going to invest, and it was going to be responsive. And Amazon, Apple, every tech company has a major operation in Texas today. You think about Europe. Think about what Ireland does. I had a similar experience. I was with the Irish Development Authority in December. They are super helpful if you're a startup in connecting you with the lawyers and the real estate developers that can help you find space. They're helpful on regulatory issues. I mean, they're very helpful when it comes to recruiting leadership. And so it's not just about taxes. It's like the Irish government has decided that they are going to be successful in tech, and they've been building on what is now a 15-year lead over other European nations. And just as in the U.S., this is a competitive game. So I think governments that understand that how they approach business and technology in particular really does matter, and they really can be helpful. That's super important.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question for Aditya. I would like to get back to a story you told about an oracle. So you said it would take 4 years to get your code into production, but technically it was solved. So it was no longer a technical problem, but more of a social political one. So maybe you felt like you were standing on the edge of a shark tank. Would you say it's a more productive mindset to think what the shark tanks do not exist?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. You're basically asking me to imagine standing on the edge of a shark tank,
No.
and then imagining if it doesn't exist.
No. I mean, shark tank as in the group of management.
Yes. Yeah, wow. I mean, I'm not 100% sure how to answer that, but what I'd say is that it's interesting that I think here's the way I'd answer it, right? The question that Dennis and I have always at Dropbox is when we're trying to set up any kind of system, any kind of construct within the company is what are the actual constraints that exist? What are the laws of physics, right? Like when Oracle basically decides that as a company it's going to take 4 years for somebody's code to ship, like what are the actual laws of physics? Like how much as a management team can we affect or not, right? And I think that what's interesting is that when you get down to it, when you kind of start taking away the different layers of it, you'll find out that as humans and as teams and as organizations, there are actually very few laws of physics that prevent you from actually achieving a lot more than you think that you're capable of. You end up a lot of the constraints that we've set up for ourselves are honestly pretty artificial. So I think that instead of thinking about the shark tank versus not, in my head there is no fucking shark tank. It's just something that I've constructed, a company has constructed in its head, and that basically is artificially essentially slowing itself down. So that's maybe my answer. There is no shark tank. Unless you want there to be one. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
So Aditya, you talk about change and how that also, every process basically changes every 6 months and so on.
Yeah.
So I have the experience that people also like stuff that stays the same.
Yeah.
And this is a bit of a problem because, as an entrepreneur, I really want to convince people that it's also good for them to be in a changing environment. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on that? How you convince people that it's also good for them if stuff changes? So basically, not only because the company is going to be there in 6 months, but also in the day-to-day, basically.
I think what you have to convince people of, I'm a firm believer that essentially like the only way to essentially grow as a company and as an individual is to be comfortable with change, right? Because historically, if you kind of think about it from any like kind of quantitative or qualitative metric, if your company is growing like 3 or 4% year over year, as opposed to like technology companies that grow like 20, 30, 40% year over year, that means that like all of the systems in your company have to change, right? And what you just have to like be able to convince people of is that like with that change comes personal growth and personal learning. And I think it's a fairly foreign concept because like what we have basically like been taught is that we are much more comfortable with like steady little bit of change every year as opposed to like a system that changes 30 or 40% every year. Like if you kind of think about it, there's no other system in our life that changes 30 or 40% every year, right? So like how do you convince people like that is a good thing? And I think it's just basically stressing about the growth and like how it's better for like a particular individual and the company. Do you have anything to add to that?
Okay, further questions?
Thanks for your question. It's a good opener for mine. I was wondering, especially with Dropbox, you talk a lot about technology. How much you talk about the user, brand, and the perception of the brand? Because I think that's so trust building. And once you lose that trust, that's, in my thing, something that's the hard thing to have in a situation, because then it becomes so much talk about, oh, now we do better, but yeah, especially when it's about data or what I feel it's my data.
Yeah, the brand, the Dropbox brand, it's incredibly powerful. I don't know, how many people here use Dropbox? Right, okay, so there you go. so I've talked to, maybe 50 audiences of this size or larger, and every time I ask the question, even like investment bankers in Japan, in Australia, everybody raises their hand, and that's often because people, a friend of them suggested they use Dropbox, they tried it, it solved a problem for them, and it continues to solve that problem. So we know that brand and that connection that people have with the company, that is the business for us. It's very hard because you can't take a classic marketing approach to how you sustain and build that brand. It's really all about the product. But at the same time, you have to communicate, and as the product evolves and as you grow, and sometimes you have problems, you have struggles, you make mistakes, you have to have a very good approach for communicating to your users. So in fast-growing technology companies, the communications team, and we have a couple of folks here from, it's super important in that regard, because you're not relying, you don't have a massive marketing budget, but yet we have to communicate with 500 million users. So we have to be really adept at social. We have to be very responsive on social, because a lot of times if there's a corner case problem, someone's using an old version of Windows and they try to sync a very obscure file type and we can't handle it. They're not gonna write in an email via email to us. They're gonna tweet, Dropbox didn't work for me, right? And we need to see that quickly, respond to it quickly before either misinformation spreads, or we also want to get back to that user and solve their problem. So the communications team, social team, super important for just understanding what's going on with the brand, what are people saying, how is that brand changing over time. And the other team that's really important, we have a team called Customer Experience. Their job is to actually answer questions that do come in via email and phone and chat. And what we try to do is instrument the kinds of questions that we're getting so we understand trends, we can feed back information to the engineering teams to make modifications to the product and get insights from all of those different data points, social, the customer experience, interactions, what people are saying about us out there, all those go into how we manage the brand. But none of that's taught in business school or in brand management school. It's a very specific to a sort of fast-growing tech company that's at our stage of growth.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
What is your approach towards managing your team? We had a discussion before that you have, or used to have, 3 years ago, 200 employees and managed them to 3 human resources officers. How did you do that? You mentioned before bottom-up approaches towards top-down approaches, leadership versus self-organization. And what do you think about this quantum biochemical approach to managing?
I don't know if I have a super succinct, pithy answer to how we choose to manage our teams. What I'd say is that at least my particular approach is twofold. Number one, and this is actually like Dropbox's approach in general, which is we believe very, very strongly in hiring the best people in the field, right? Like our approach to hiring is very, very rigorous, very, very principled in terms of like how we actually end up interviewing people, evaluating them, and kind of putting them through debrief and so on. But the reason why we actually believe in hiring the best is because from day one, Drew and Arash's approach has always been that if you can hire the best people, you can give them essentially like the most leeway, right? Like you do not need to micromanage them. You can essentially give them space. You can let them be creative. You can essentially like let them own the particular problem that they are like essentially like hired to do. But the only way you can actually do that is if you have a firm belief that you've hired the best people. So I think a lot of at least our management practices at Dropbox come back to essentially being principled, being structured, but also making sure we're getting the best people.
I can add something from our perspective, Mesosphere. So I think what's really helpful is to put some frameworks in place, right? Like so, first of all, of course, you need managers, right, in the organization, and I think managers, really good managers, are super important because management is not easy. But one of the frameworks that we put in place actually at Mesosphere was we said very early on we wanted to have some core values. And we want to have the core values be a framework that anybody can use to evaluate how they're doing themselves in our organization. And values, a lot of companies have them. There's a company called Enron, or there was a company called Enron that had great core values, integrity and trust and honesty, right? And obviously these values, when you look at Enron, they were nonsensical, right? But we looked at core values very early on, and our head of people operations actually and I sat down for a couple of weeks, and we really wanted to really nail this. She's actually phenomenal. So Joni is our head of HR, and she actually started at Apple running international HR in 2002 and worked there, hired by Steve Jobs, and worked there from 2002 till 2010 when she retired. And then we had to talk her out of retirement, which is a hard thing to do. Yeah, so she and I, we sat down and we really like tried to think about how can we get these values established. And actually at Mesosphere we have 3 core values, and our first one is customer first, right? So we're a customer-centric company, and we want to always think about our customers. The second one is really important as well. It's team always. So we always want to make sure we're a team. We give each other critical feedback, but we are also nice to each other and so forth. And the third one is ship it, right? We gotta get stuff done. So these are our 3 core values, and actually everything we have in the company, when it comes to self-evaluation of people, it feeds back into these 3 core values. And it's really great because you get to have this framework in place, and then you get to design a lot of systems around it, like performance evaluation and so forth. Yeah. And so that's kind of I think frameworks are really important because it's a guideline for managers of how to evaluate. And then another thing we do actually is we do a lot of one-on-ones. So every manager does a one-on-one weekly with their direct reports. I think it's really important that you get face time with the folks you manage.